She was two missed shots away from losing her entire career, and almost nobody watching the WNBA had any idea it was happening. Because the player who was quietly falling apart inside that locker room is the same player who, 3 years later, would stand in front of a room full of cameras and say the one thing every other athlete in her position is too scared to admit out loud. And what she admitted didn't just expose her own story. It exposed something almost every team in that league had been saying behind closed doors, something that Indiana Fever players had been hearing whispered in opposing locker rooms for 2 straight years. Stay with this one until the end, because the way this story actually resolved only became official a few months ago, and it changes everything about how you should look back on it. Before we get into it, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's get into it. There is a specific kind of fear that only exists in professional sports, and almost nobody who hasn't lived it can fully understand it. It's not the fear of losing a game. It's the fear that one single possession, one bad read, one missed jumper, could be the exact moment someone in the front office decides you don't belong anymore. For most professional athletes, that fear shows up occasionally. A slump, a rough stretch, a benching. For Lexie Hull, that fear didn't show up occasionally. It lived with her every single night for 2 full years, and she kept it almost entirely to herself. On paper, none of that should have made sense. Lexie Hull walked into the WNBA in 2022 looking like exactly the kind of prospect franchises dream about. She was the 6th overall pick. She came out of Stanford with a national championship on her resume from 2021. She had been named to multiple All-Pac-12 teams and had earned the Elite 90 award, an honor reserved for the athlete with the best combination of academic performance and athletic achievement in her sport. Every credential you could ask for was sitting right there in her file. At Stanford, she had been a 4-year starter, someone coaches pointed to as proof that toughness and intelligence could coexist at the highest level of the sport. She graduated with a management degree, carried a high GPA through her entire college career, and was regularly described by teammates as one of the most prepared players in any locker room she walked into. None of that is the kind of resume that usually ends up buried under a stat line of under 5 points a game. And yet, that's exactly what happened. What none of those credentials told you was what she was actually walking into. The Indiana Fever in 2022 were, by almost every measure, one of the worst franchises in the entire league. Losing seasons stacked on losing seasons. No playoff appearances. A locker room that had been trying to find its footing for years and kept coming up empty. And if you've ever wondered what the hardest possible environment is for a young professional trying to prove herself, it's exactly that one. A team that is also fighting just to survive, where every mistake feels like it's being filed away as evidence against you. Here's the part that should stop you for a second. Lexie Hull, a top 10 draft pick with a national championship pedigree, averaged under 5 points a game in each of her first 2 professional seasons. Real numbers, not exaggerated ones. Under 5 points a game, 2 years in a row. Those aren't just disappointing numbers for a player of her caliber. Those are the kind of numbers that quietly end careers before the rest of the league ever gets a real look at them. But the box score only tells you half of what was actually happening. What was happening inside her head was the part nobody outside that building could see, and it's the part that makes this story worth understanding. Because years later, she finally said it plainly, in her own words. She described what it was like to genuinely believe that a single missed shot could be the reason she got cut from the roster entirely. In her own words, there were stretches early in her career where the pressure got so specific that if she took a shot, it needed to go in, because otherwise she thought she might get benched, or worse, cut completely. Think about that for a second. A Stanford graduate, a national champion, a top 10 pick, lying awake with the kind of fear that has nothing to do with basketball skill and everything to do with survival. That is what a losing culture does to a player who has no safety net underneath her. Every mistake gets magnified. Every good process that doesn't produce a result feels like proof that she doesn't belong. And she was living inside that environment for 2 years, completely alone with it, while the rest of the basketball world had no idea her career was hanging by a thread. What makes this part of the story matter is not just the honesty of it, it's the clarity. She understood exactly what was happening to her while it was happening. She could name the fear, explain how it had crept into her shot mechanics, her decision-making, her instincts in the middle of live games. That kind of self-awareness is rare in professional sports, and it's exactly what allowed her to respond the way she did when the entire situation around her changed overnight. Because in April of 2024, everything changed. The Indiana Fever selected Caitlin Clark with the first overall pick in the WNBA draft. If you need a reminder of what that actually meant, Clark had just finished the most prolific scoring career in the history of NCAA basketball on either the men's or women's side. She had turned Big Ten basketball into appointment television. She had shattered records that had stood for decades and filled arenas in cities that had never once sold out for women's college basketball. The only real question hanging over her entrance into the league was whether any of it would translate to the professional level or whether it was a college phenomenon that would quietly disappear the moment she stepped onto a WNBA floor. The answer came almost immediately, and it wasn't subtle. Clark shattered WNBA records for attendance, television viewership, and rookie production, numbers that made the league's previous benchmarks look small by comparison. The Fever went from a forgotten franchise to the single most talked about team in women's sports, seemingly overnight. Sellout crowds followed the team on the road to arenas that had never come close to selling out for a WNBA game before. National broadcasts that used to skip past Indiana entirely were suddenly fighting for the rights to carry Fever games. But what mattered most to the players who were already in that building wasn't the attention. It was what Clark brought to the actual game itself. And for Lexie Hull specifically, that turned out to be the single biggest turning point of her professional life. There were real questions swirling before Clark ever played a single regular season minute. Could a college phenomenon actually translate to grown women who had been getting paid to play defense for years? Would the physicality of the professional game expose the parts of her game that hadn't been tested at Iowa? Those questions didn't last long. And once they were answered, the conversation inside that Fever locker room shifted from survival to opportunity. And nobody benefited from that shift more than the player who had spent 2 years fighting just to stay on the roster. There's a certain type of player who changes the game for everyone around her without necessarily dominating the box score herself. Clark is obviously an elite scorer in her own right, but according to the people who share the floor with her, her most underrated quality is her vision. Her ability to read a defense multiple steps ahead of where the play actually is, and to draw so much defensive attention that openings appear for teammates almost before the defense can react to them. For Lexie Hull, that meant something she had barely experienced across 2 full professional seasons: wide open looks. Clean, uncontested opportunities from the perimeter that weren't the byproduct of a broken play or a lucky bounce, but the direct result of a teammate who could see the floor better than almost anyone in the league. The results were immediate. In 2024, Lexie Hull shot 47.1% from three-point range, the second best mark in the entire WNBA that season. For context, that's a dramatic jump from what she had shown earlier in her career, and it happened the exact moment the psychological weight of a losing culture stopped pressing down on every single shot she took. In her own words, once she trusted that the open looks were going to keep coming, she stopped gripping every attempt like it might be her last, and she let herself live with whatever the outcome was. That kind of freedom doesn't come from a shooting coach or a film session. It comes from trust in a system, in a teammate, and eventually in yourself. Clark had given her the first 2. Hull had to find the third one on her own. But the court was only one part of what was changing. Off it, something nobody expected was happening just as fast. When Clark was drafted, there were real questions about how she would fit into a locker room full of players who had already spent years building relationships without her. She was walking in as the most famous player in the sport, carrying more media attention than almost any WNBA player in recent memory. Would the room accept her? Would the imbalance in attention create resentment? Nobody knew for certain. What actually happened was close to the opposite, and it started with Lexie Hull. The two of them clicked almost immediately, and not in the polished, carefully managed way athletes are often coached to present friendships for cameras. This was the real thing. They spent time together off the court in Indianapolis. They filmed content together. During the league's Olympic break, when players were sent on a trip together, the two of them were inseparable in a way that was obvious to anyone paying attention. By the 2025 season, that friendship had grown into something bigger, with its own identity inside WNBA culture. Sophie Cunningham, who had been brought to Indiana in a trade, became the third piece, and the trio started calling themselves the Tres Leches. It became one of the most entertaining and genuinely likable storylines in the entire league. They caddied for each other at LPGA Pro-Am events. They roasted each other constantly on social media. When Clark posted a set of Fever Media Day photos with a caption about being back for another year, Hull couldn't resist teasing her about needing a little more sun exposure, and the exchange became one of the funnier off-season moments the league had seen in years. It was the kind of friendship fans almost never get an unfiltered look at. Three teammates who were genuinely, visibly close, not because a marketing team told them to be. And then Hull confirmed something that had already been an open secret. Clark would be at her wedding. That wasn't a throwaway comment. Hull had gotten engaged in April of 2025 to Will Mathieson, a former Stanford baseball player she had met on campus years earlier and had been with since 2020. Mathieson had gone on to play in the Pittsburgh Pirates organization before injuries forced him out of professional baseball, and after Hull was drafted to Indianapolis, he relocated to be with her, eventually building a career of his own in finance. The proposal happened on a beach getaway, and by late 2025, the two of them were already deep into planning a wedding. That's not a manufactured storyline. That's a real one. But even as all of this was unfolding, something else was quietly building underneath it, something that would eventually force Lexie Hull to say publicly what most players in her position choose to avoid saying at all. The 2025 season arrived with enormous expectations. Clark had just finished the most impactful rookie year the league had ever seen, and by all accounts, she came back for year two sharper, more focused, and more locked in than ever before. Through the first stretch of games, it wasn't even Clark who was the best player on the floor for Indiana. It was Hull. She was leading the entire WNBA in three-point shooting percentage, over 55% at one stretch, putting together the best basketball of her career. The Fever looked like a completely different team, one with real, legitimate championship potential. And then the injuries started. Clark's quad went first, then her groin, then a bone bruise in her ankle. By mid-July, she was already dealing with her fourth separate physical setback of the year. This one during a game against the Connecticut Sun on July 15th. The image from that night became one of the defining moments of the entire season. Clark walked off the floor, sat on the bench, and covered her face with a towel, her forehead resting against the basket support, physically and emotionally spent. And sitting right next to her, not saying a word, just present, was Lexie Hull. Hull spoke about that stretch afterward with a kind of honesty that felt deliberate. She described watching her closest friend on the team go through pure frustration, the kind that only comes when your body refuses to cooperate with everything your mind and your work ethic are demanding of it. That decline wasn't from a lack of effort. It was despite an almost superhuman amount of it, and Hull understood that distinction clearly because she'd lived a version of it herself. Despite losing Clark for long stretches, the Fever fought all the way to the WNBA semifinals, taking the eventual champion Las Vegas Aces to a decisive fifth game before their season ended. Hull's fingerprints were all over that run, but not in the way highlight reels usually capture. She was guarding the other team's best perimeter scorer every single night. She was making the two-way plays that keep a season alive when almost everything else is working against you. There was a night against Seattle where she absorbed a hard collision going after a loose ball and came away with a knot on her forehead and two black eyes, and she was back on the floor within days because that's the kind of season it had become for her. She finished the year with career highs across the board: points, rebounds, assists, and steals, while carrying the emotional weight of watching her best friend battle through one of the hardest stretches of her career. Clark said it best herself once the season ended. She talked about how Hull never once complained, even during the stretch early in her career when she barely saw the floor, and how that exact same selflessness was still there years later, even as the games got bigger and the stakes got higher. That kind of endorsement, coming from the most scrutinized player in the sport, tells you everything about how much respect Hull had actually earned inside that locker room by the time the season was over. All of that build-up led to a moment in late October of 2025 that Hull had clearly been thinking about for a long time. Glamour magazine named her one of its Women of the Year, alongside some of the most recognizable names across sports and entertainment. Most people expected the usual polished, safe interview, a little backstory, a quote about friendship, a photo shoot. What actually happened was something else entirely. Hull used that platform to say something most players in her exact position never say publicly. She acknowledged that there was real jealousy directed at the Fever around the league, tied directly to the media attention and the fan base that had exploded because of Clark's arrival. And she went further than that. She said the team had heard it firsthand, not secondhand gossip, not outside speculation, but players and coaching staffs from other franchises openly saying inside their own locker rooms that they could not let the Fever win. Sit with what that actually means on a practical level. Every single game the Indiana Fever play is treated by opponents like it carries playoff stakes. Every matchup against Clark and her teammates gets an intensity that goes beyond a normal regular season night. Every official's call gets filmed, dissected, and turned into ammunition by people who may have never watched a full WNBA game in their lives before Clark arrived. And every player on that roster has to live inside that pressure every single night of the season. Lexie Hull had been living inside it for 2 years by the time she said any of this out loud. She had felt it in body language on the floor. She had heard it from the mouths of the people playing against her. And when she finally decided to talk about it, she didn't frame it as a complaint or a plea for sympathy. Her response was essentially, use it. If opponents need extra motivation to come at Indiana harder, then fine, because everyone deserves to face the best version of the teams they're playing. That is a genuinely rare response from an athlete who has every reason to feel resentful about the circumstances surrounding her. Step back and look at the entire arc of this story for a second, because this is where it actually gets interesting. She entered the league as a gifted player on a franchise that was quietly falling apart. She spent 2 years fighting just to hold a roster spot, playing under a level of psychological pressure that almost nobody around her understood, let alone knew existed. Then the most disruptive force women's basketball has ever produced walked into the building, and every single variable around her changed at once. Her shot got freed up. Her role expanded. Her closest friendship in the sport became one of the most visible and genuine in the entire league, and she did all of it while being honest, in public, about exactly what it looked like from the inside. But here's the part that puts a real question mark over everything you just heard, because right after that glamour interview, Lexie Hull walked straight into the most uncertain professional moment of her career. She was entering the 2025 offseason as a restricted free agent for the very first time. That is a completely different kind of pressure than anything she'd faced before. Early in her career, the question was whether she'd make the roster at all. Now the question was whether the team she had helped rebuild from nothing would actually find a way to keep her. Under restricted free agency rules, the Fever technically had the right to match any offer she received from another franchise. But that doesn't guarantee anything in a league where the collective bargaining landscape was shifting fast and every front office was fighting over a shrinking pool of money. Hull herself admitted publicly during her exit interview that there was a lot of uncertainty, that she loved Indiana, that she'd built a life there, but that she genuinely didn't know what was going to happen next. For months, that uncertainty just sat there, unresolved, hanging over one of the most feel-good stories in the entire league. So what actually happened? Did the team that Lexie Hull helped drag out of the bottom of the standings find a way to keep her, or did she walk away from the exact locker room she'd fought so hard to belong in? In April of 2026, the answer finally came. Lexie Hull announced in a video posted alongside Caitlin Clark that she was signing a multi-year deal to stay with the Indiana Fever. According to reporting at the time, she had weighed serious interest from other teams during free agency and still chose to come back, specifically to keep that young core intact. The Fever also brought back Kelsey Mitchell around the same time, locking in the exact group of players, Clark, Hull, Mitchell, and Aliyah Boston, that had carried the franchise all the way to the semifinals the year before. Lexie Hull's story didn't end on a cliffhanger. It ended with her choosing on purpose to stay exactly where she fought hardest to survive. The same player who once lay awake, convinced a single missed shot could end her career, is now under contract for multiple more seasons with the franchise she helped completely transform. She knows exactly who she is now, as a player and as a person, in a way she absolutely did not when she walked into that building as a scared 6th overall pick back in 2022. And that's really what makes this story worth remembering. It was never actually about being in Caitlin Clark's shadow. It was about what Lexie Hull built in spite of it, and what she chose to do the moment she finally had the power to choose for herself. If this story stuck with you, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more of this coming, and you don't want to miss what happens next inside that Indiana Fever locker room.